Dr. Jazz.
But I'll just jump in. You know, it's incredible that after such a long time being involved with music and piano, and you're still incredibly active. And I listened to Telepathy today, you know, with your duo with George Marsh, and man, incredible. How do you do that, and where do you get the energy? And but I wanted to ask you, like, you know, I've read the liner notes on Bandcamp, how this story with George has been happening, but if you can just lead me through, you know, how do these sessions start, and especially your, you know, you've been an extremely prolific and amazing composer. I mean, I want to talk about this later, but I want to talk about also about this free improvisation stuff you do. How do you approach this usually, and what's the story there?
Sure. Well, I guess free improvisation really is the way I first began to play music, Samo. I mean, when I was about 2 or 3 years old, I used to climb into the family Steinway, right into the action of the keys and everything, and just start making noise on the strings and pounding on the hammers and everything, just to try to get some interesting timbral things happening. And then eventually, when I was able to actually depress the keyboard itself, I started just making little melodies and stuff, and I was always interested in kind of unusual shapes and sounds of things. And I think my parents very wisely protected me from formal study for a number of years and just let me be kind of a free improviser at the piano. And it wasn't until I think I was about maybe 6 or 7, I asked to start studying classical music. And so then I started studying classical music during my grade school years, played a fair amount of the piano literature, always drawn more towards the modern composers. It's almost like I made a jump from loving Bach, and then I jumped all the way to the Impressionists. Only later in life I went back and appreciated what had happened in between, but always a hunger for unusual sounds and timbres. And when I first heard jazz, I think that was one of the things that appealed to me so much in 8th grade. My music teacher brought me a 10-inch LP on MGM Records called You're Hearing George Shearing.
Oh, wow, man.
And I listened to that. I said, wow, who is this guy? He's got this classical technique and chops, but he's playing this music that has this drive and rhythm, and it sounds like he's making up some stuff. What is this? So I felt like I was shot out of a cannon, and I just started devouring everything I could in jazz. And again, after a very brief sojourn with Dixieland in freshman year in high school, I was into bebop and beyond. And again, the hunger for those kinds of timbres and the interest in free improvisation persisted there. And then when I began to hear some of the more experimental kinds of modern jazz and listening more and more to modern 20th century music, that expanded my harmonic and rhythmic palette quite a bit. So when I started having my own trios and things, I certainly was interested in trying to integrate the modern jazz literature, but trying to find a way to put my own personal stamp on this. What could really speak to me using these pieces as vehicles? So I found myself finding longer forms, and in my composition using unusual time signatures and shifting textures and things, that this kept my interest up in the music. And I think in improvising, I like the idea sometimes of purposely creating hurdles that need to be gracefully jumped over, and that produces some new music that you might not find otherwise. So I like that kind of challenge in the music. And then when I started getting into electronic music, I had done, I guess, a series of 5 albums for Columbia Records in the mid 60s.
Yeah.
I was in medical school when I started to record. I did an album with Jeremy Steig, a wonderful flute player.
Flute fever, yeah. I have
Flute
a link
fever.
for that. Yeah, amazing.
And then I did 4 trio albums in a modern jazz acoustic format for Columbia. And then I really had such a hunger to get beyond what I felt then were the limitations of the acoustic piano sound. As much as I loved the instrument, I couldn't sustain notes. I couldn't bend notes like you guitar players can. And I was hungry to be able to taste some of that. So I started getting people to build me special electronic modules, and I started getting some electronic keyboards. And this was like 1967, 68.
Oh, wow. That's really
There wasn't a lot of stuff available back then. So I started getting people together to play, and very soon I had this group with Mel Graves and George Marsh on drums. And that's when I really started exploring the potential of free improvisation with a group. I mean, I had done this acoustically with people like Charlie Haden and Jerry Granelli.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that later. Yeah,
but this was a chance to do it in a multi-timbral way, which was very appealing to me. So we really started developing that music, and I stayed in that format for about a decade, from about like 68 to 78. And that period of my life sort of temporarily ended in 1978 when I did the electronic acoustic symphonic score for a remake of a classic science fiction horror movie, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And so that gave me a chance to bring together everything I'd ever been working on electronically, as well as compositionally. And I'd never written for a symphony orchestra before, so that was a big challenge and a thrill. But after that was over, I felt kind of exhausted, and I wanted to go back to the purity of the acoustic piano for a while, which is what I did for several decades, until around the turn of the century, when there was a tremendous growth in the technology of electronic music that sort of pulled me back in, because now it looked like if I got back into this, I could get closer to what my goal had always been with these multi-timbral instruments. Is I wanted to be an orchestra. I wanted to be able to do it all myself, in some way. And having all those sounds available would mean that maybe I could be a galactic orchestra, just have a whole universe of sounds available in real time. Yeah. So that's what I've been working towards since I got back into electronics. And George Marsh really came back into my life full force around 2013, 2014, when he started coming by my house periodically. And we would just decide all we're going to do is free improvisation. Oh. Absolutely no preconception, premeditation, or anything. My studio is set up actually so that in order to get good separation of sound with the sound barriers, we can't even see each other. Oh. But we're wearing headphones, and I just turn on Pro Tools and we play. And so over time, we just, I think, grew as a duo to be able to spontaneously make compositions, because we didn't want it to just be electronic acoustic noodling. We wanted these pieces to say something, to take people on a journey, to have some kind of structural integrity that was implicit, if not obvious. And that's what we kept working on and doing. And then we made a series of albums for Sunny Side Records. The first one was called Riding the Moment. And the next one was called Expedition, and the one you mentioned is the more recent one that came out last May, called Telepathy, which I think is our strongest album.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah, beautiful playing.
And so that was just great fun to keep growing in that dimension of trying to just allow a spontaneous composition to emerge. And I think the biggest challenge is to get out of the way of the music. Just to let it happen and not consciously manipulate it. Just when we're playing our best, I feel like we're in the audience listening to the music.
Yeah, it's hard to achieve that when you're playing free. It's it takes a lot of courage and forgetting about fear that sometimes, you know, that you're afraid of what you can do or not. You know, I think that's so important when playing free, even if we do it, and it's just that you're like you said, you know, you go out, step out of yourself, and you're like, okay,
Yeah.
let's.
And I think being willing, if you get stuck, that's a tremendous opportunity, you know,
Yeah.
to make something new out of it. You know, you make a quote unquote mistake that may turn out to be the thing that turns the piece into the most interesting direction.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's like it's beautiful. There's like Bill Frisell. He did a video years ago. Like it was actually a VHS tape, video tape, and he's playing and noodling something. I think it's on a standard, and then he plays a harmonic on a guitar, and it's like a wrong one, kind of. And then amazingly, he just follows that wrong one, and it's just like, man, wow. And that's exactly what you say, you know, like press a minor second instead of whatever is supposed to be. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's the beauty of music and the sound. That's incredible.
And we're I guess another way of putting it too is that when George and I play, we're hoping to surprise ourselves and each other.
Yeah.
You know, and that surprise, it's an invitation to new music, you know.
Yeah. Especially, I guess, for you now, since you said, you know, in the late 60s, you had modules built and to make sounds and stuff like that. And nowadays, you know, for you must be incredible. Now you actually, everything is on a press of a button and you have like this orchestra or that sound, and it
is just wonderful. And I've just recently started to make a new addition to my sort of electronic studio arsenal. You know, I've got about 5 electronic keyboards and the acoustic piano, and you know, all these foot pedals and switches and you know, iPads and
sure.
Using a lot of breath control, which is breath and bite control, both, which is very helpful to me to shape the sounds. But there's a new company that I've just gotten involved with, that my engineers in the process of weaving into the fabric of the rest of the system. Is a company called Audio Modeling, really doing innovative stuff. They have a kind of an approach called SWAM. I think it's an amazing kind of audio modeling. It's synchronous wave audio modeling is what that acronym stands for. They've got a lot of stuff on the internet if you ever want to just check it out.
Check it out, yeah.
The way they have managed, using primarily physical modeling, to emulate the sound of acoustic instruments is utterly amazing, man. I mean, the sounds are just totally believable. And with physical modeling, then you can shape these sounds in real time. You're not sort of stuck with how it had been sampled. It's like an alive instrument. So it's a tremendous thing. I've got physical modeling on a number of things already in my rig, which I've been using for years, but this is going to be another quantum step forward for me. So I'm very excited to get that up and running.
It's beautiful. Nice to see you have this enthusiasm, you know, when new things come up, and it's like, yeah, you know, being like a small kid, like, okay, I need this. Yeah, it's beautiful to see that. So that's nice. But you know, you mentioned also like acoustic playing, and I wanted to ask you about the trio with Buster and Matt Wilson also. Yeah. Speaking of recent work, that Live at Mesereau for Sunnyside, and you know, you and Buster, of course, you know, you started with Al Foster, that late 90s record, but like also with Matt, it's an incredible chemistry you guys have. And how do you see the development of this trio now? If you look at back, I guess, of some bootleg recordings or whatever, if you imagine this trio, how has the development, if you look at it, like the chemistry you guys developed, and compared to the first time you played or the first gig?
Well, it's interesting. With Matt and Buster, it ends up, we started playing. I think our first gig was in 2001. I had a gig to play at the San Francisco Jazz Festival, and So I called Buster to see whether he'd be available. We'd never done a tour together. I had done this album that you mentioned with Al Foster.
Yeah. As long as there's music, yeah.
As long as there's music. And I loved playing with both of them. And I called Buster to see if he was available for the tour, and he was. But Al Foster was not. So I asked a friend of mine who I trusted. I said, man, I got to get a really super drummer for this thing. Who would you recommend? You know how I play, man. The guy said, you ought to listen to this cat, Matt Wilson, man. He's a young cat, but he's really, really good. So I went out on the internet, was able to hear a little bit. I said, oh, yeah, this cat can play. So I called Matt, and it turned out Matt was a fan of Buster and a fan of my music and was delighted to come. And so he came the night before the concert. Matt came, and I went through the pieces we were going to play with him. Buster wasn't here yet. Buster arrived just in time for the gig. We had never played together live as a trio. We walked out on the stage, and it was like a hand in a glove. It was just effortless.
Yeah.
And that's really how it's been with those guys. I can't point to some specific new development. It's just that there has been a total sense of empathy and belief and trust in each other's music when we get together, and the music can go anywhere. It just goes where it seems to need to go. Because, I mean, on that first tour, I was able to record a gig we did at the Jazz Workshop. Eventually was released on an album. And, you know, you could listen to that album, which was called Stairway to the Stars, and you could listen to the album live at Mesro, which was done 20 years later, and I don't think you'd say it sounds like two totally different groups at all. It sounds like, those cats, So I just think it's more, I think, a testament to the fact that individually we've all kept growing, but there's such a respect for what we can do as a trio that we get together and it just happens.
Yeah. With Buster, did you ever play before with Buster? Or
Buster, the first time I'd ever played with Buster was when I made that album. As long as
Al. Oh, okay.
I never played with him before. I'd always loved listening to him.
Oh, sure.
And when I guess it was Todd Barkin was the producer for that date. He said, "Man, who do you want to use? You can hire whoever you want." I said, "Man, I've never had a chance to play with Buster Williams, man. I love that cat's music." So we got Buster and we got Al, and that was a lot of fun. And
yeah, I imagine. Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, all these records. I mean, I love Matt. He's such an amazing drummer and such an amazing composer. Also, I mean, Buster as well, of course. It's so beautiful to hear you guys play together.
Yeah,
it's so amazing. But Danny, I wanted to ask you, like, you mentioned Flute Fever before, and you coming from, I guess, studying in Chicago, and I've read about these early years when you were, like, I guess, even before 20, that you already got to play in Chicago with all these incredible musicians. And how did that happen, actually? I mean, if you can...
Well, let's see. I mean, I first heard jazz in 8th grade. Then I went to Highland Park High School, which was a suburb of Chicago. And I started forming my own little bands in high school and going to sessions in and around the high school. And then I was going into Chicago, listening to music. Fortunately, I was tall. I had a fake ID, so I could go into these clubs and stay all night and listen to music. And there was a tremendous amount going on, particularly on the south side of Chicago, in the black section of town. That's where the really serious bebop stuff was happening. And I was able to go to those clubs, and there was a refreshing lack of Crow Jim feeling. Nobody seemed to resent that this young white cat was coming to their club. There was no sense. I think they understood I wanted to learn this music. I had tremendous respect for the musicians and the music. I just wanted to soak it up and learn. And then gradually, people let me start sitting in. So I would get a kind of an informal apprenticeship in this music on the bandstand. There were no jazz schools back there. I don't even know that anybody had private teachers in jazz. The way one learned, you listened to records, you jammed, you tried to get people to show you stuff. in between sets, I'd get a piano player to say, "How did you voice that chord, man? What did you do there?" You know, and there were people that were graciously would show me stuff, and that's how I sort of gradually got some proficiency together, was in this sort of osmotic way of just absorbing what I could and just being on the stand and taking chances and hoping that they wouldn't kick me off, you know, they give me a chance to play, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's the best way to learn. That's the most you remember.
Yeah.
And also about learning, you know, about the scales and stuff. Also, it was through that, like, you know, or harmony, like, you know, what symbols and, you know, all this jazz language, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I remember my music teacher taught me very basic harmony. And from there, it was just really my listening and just working out sounds and ways I'd find ways I wanted to voice things, and I'd hear something that interested me. And I said, how was that done? And I'd hear some chord in a modern classical composition, and I'd try to figure out what that was, you know, and how can I use that material? I never had much of a desire to keep up a classical repertoire, but I was very interested to understand how it was put together so I might be able to use that material for my own compositions and my own improvisations. That's what really interested me.
That's important. Yeah, that's what's important, actually. Yeah. I mean, and you mentioned then Flute Fever, which was, I guess, the first record you got featured on, right?
That was in 1963.
How did it happen with Jeremy? I mean, you know, Jeremy is still, of course, one of the greatest flute players ever. But how did that story with Jeremy happen?
Well, I was a medical student at Johns Hopkins Medical School in Baltimore, and I got a fellowship for 10 weeks while I was a medical student to Columbia University in Manhattan, New York City. So I rented an apartment for 10 weeks, and I'm doing a psychiatric fellowship. But I was interested in what was happening in the jazz scene, and I had a friend that I had met in Chicago named Paul Winter.
Oh, really? Oh, man.
Who had begun to record for Columbia. I think his first album might have been in 61 or 62. And Paul always loved my playing, and he was saying, "Denny, I want to introduce you to my producer, John Hammond. I think he would love your music, man. I think he'd love to record you." And I said, "Paul, I don't want to get into recording, man. I don't want anybody telling me what to play. I've heard stories about what happens in these studios where A&R men tell you what to play and how many choruses to play and try to dumb down the music. I don't want to do this." But he kept at me, and eventually he grabbed me by the ear to meet John Hammond. And John Hammond turned out to be this really lovely, enthusiastic guy. He just asked me to play some music for me. He had a piano there, and I played a couple pieces. Said, "I'd love to record you. I'd like, please come to Columbia. You can record whatever you want, use whomever you want. You could do whatever you want. I'd just love to have you be a part of it." So, I mean, that was so ridiculously lucky and inviting. I said, "Okay, sure." And so he said, "Look, I'd like you to get your feet wet in the recording studio by being a featured pianist on an album that's coming up. There's this wonderful flute player that I'm bringing into Columbia that I think you'd love to play with him, and it'd be a great opportunity for you to sort of be part of the recording scene." That's how it happened, man. And I met Jeremy briefly for an hour or two, a day or two before the recording session. We talked about what Jeremy wanted to play. And he mentioned that one of the things he wanted to do during the date is that he liked to have temper tantrums musically when he played. And I said, "That's okay with me." And so we went into the studio with wonderful players, Ben Tucker and Ben Riley.
Ben Riley, yeah.
No rehearsal at all. It was essentially a blowing date done in just 2 afternoons on a weekend, and that was it. But I thought it was a hell of an album, man. I loved it.
Oh, Leo, man, on that one when it starts.
The experience. It was a great opportunity for me to get my feet wet in the recording studio. And
that's incredible. But then you mentioned, like, John said, like, you can call whoever. Like, how did those two trios with Charlie and Jerry Granelli happen, and the other one with Cecil, McBee, and Freddie Wade? So why these players? And I mean, both albums are amazing. The compositions, man, that one repeats I think it's the first one, the up tempo. But like, how did these two trios evolve, or why these players?
Well, let's see. When I did that first album with Jeremy Steig, and then John Hammond said, "Look, I'd love for you to do some trio albums for Columbia. So just think about who you might like to use." And started thinking, was there anybody in Baltimore that I felt really close enough to musically to use? It didn't feel quite like the right fit, and I thought, well, I ought to try to take a really fresh look at what this might be, and then it turned out Paul Winter said, "Look, man, Cecil McBee and Freddie Waits in my group are just wonderful players, man, and they would love to play with you." And so we got together and just had one brief rehearsal, and it went terrifically. And it's just went into the studio the next day, and it just felt very comfortable. They were very
amazing, beautiful record.
Because some of the forms I had were a little different, and harmonically unusual. And Cecil got right into it, and Freddie was super open to it. And he had a wonderful feel on the drums. So I thought that was a terrific trio. I would have loved to have toured with those guys, but as it turned out, I go back to Baltimore. I'm in medical school. I don't have time to tour, and then I'm an intern out in San Francisco. And that's where I've made a new home. So then I had to think of, well, here I am in San Francisco. Who can I get to play with?
Okay, sure.
And that's when I found Charlie Haden. I'd loved Charlie's work with Ornette, and I called him up. He was living in Synanon at that time, and it turned out he'd heard the Cathexis album I had done for Columbia with Cecil and he'd really enjoyed it. So we got together and we felt very close musically. And then we set about trying to find a drummer. And I heard about this guy, Jerry Granelli, and he came and played. And then, we had something special, we thought. And so we played together for, I think, almost 3 years, 2.5 years.
Oh, wow.
Did 2.5 albums together. And then Charlie wanted to go back to New York. And Jerry Granelli was getting into some other stuff.
Yeah.
That's when I met Oliver Johnson and Joe Halpin, who did a part of the album called Zeitgeist with me. I played with them for about 1.5 years. They were terrific too. I thought, I just think I've been lucky finding great players, man, over the years, particularly since I'm not a full-time musician. It's not. So I was able to find this kind of quality to play with. I feel very lucky to just have been able to keep music and medicine alive all these years,
Especially with Charlie, you seem to have an amazing connection, like especially the duo album. Time Remembers.
One Time Once.
Yeah, it's incredible, hearing. How was it for you, like, to play with Charlie in duo, just because it's so intimate? That album is so beautiful.
It was very special because Charlie's sound and his time was so perfect, man. There's such a cushion when you're playing with Charlie. It's and he has radar ears harmonically, so anywhere I might go, he would find something that would complement it so beautifully, and his sound. I mean, you hear one note from Charlie Haden, it's Charlie Haden. I mean, it's just an amazing bass sound. It's just one of a kind, man.
And you played Bird Food. I think he played Bird Food with Ornette also, right?
Yeah.
Must have been amazing, right? I mean,
yeah, it was great fun. Yeah, we did several Ornette tunes together that were great fun.
Yeah. How did Charlie think of your composition? I sometimes challenge myself, and I try to write out lead sheets.
Mm-hmm.
Emphasis on trying many times, because probably if the composer saw it, we're like, well, that's not this chord. But like, you wrote some amazingly complicated music also, and but with Charlie, beautiful ballads and this other specter. But like, did you talk about composition with Charlie also sometimes, or?
Didn't talk about composition with him, really. I mean, I would present some new pieces, and we would play them and work on get comfortable with it. Never talked about composition per se with him.
Okay, yeah. But what's your story with composing? You mentioned before like odd meters, and you seem to love those like there you have tunes in 7 but then you have like Mirage, which is like, I don't know why. It's just like,
I don't know. That tune just seemed like every bar was different. I mean, I wasn't trying to do it. It's just the way I was hearing this melody. I had to write it out. I said, oh, so that's 3, that's 4. Oh, that's 13. Oh, well, man, I better write it out here. If I want them to play it, I got to write it out.
I mean, how do you compose usually, or how did you like? Did you start like with harmony or melody, or?
I usually compose by just turning on the recorder and start to improvise, man. I just saying, I hope some piece might emerge, or maybe a fragment will come, or some melodic idea, or some unusual juxtaposition. I say, that's something maybe I can work with. Let's see where that goes. I've had very few moments like where a whole piece just crystallized out.
Yeah.
All at once. I mean, one exception is Time Remembers One Time Once. I was on my way to a surgery lecture in medical school, and all of a sudden this piece appeared, and I said, I better get back to my room and write this down. I'm going to forget it. And I just turned on my heel, ran back to my room, got some paper, and went to the piano and wrote it down before it evaporated, man. But that's the only...
That's beautiful.
That's the first time and only time an entire piece with the title appeared. And I don't even know what the title means, but the title was there in that first phrase. And I thought, okay, that's it. Time remembers one time once. What the hell does that mean, man?
It's beautiful. It's a nice one. But it's so beautiful. It's just like, what is it? Yeah. But what about Quiet Now?
That piece was actually written for a college brief theatrical show. They called them stunt shows at the University of Illinois. There was a deal every year. A fraternity would pair up with a sorority on campus, and somebody would write usually a 10 to 20 minute episode of a theatrical episode, of essentially musical theater, a brief piece of musical theater. And then the two houses would get together and collaborate, and they would do it. So I was the person that wrote the music for the stunt shows for our fraternity, and I guess it was maybe around 1958 or so. We were writing a show, and somebody had provided a libretto that had to do with love found and then love lost. And so it really had to do with the heartbreak of losing one's love. And so this ballad emerged as the final piece in that show. And I called it Quiet Now because I was resonating with the awesome silence of finding yourself alone after having been deeply connected with somebody. So the piece had that kind of quality of loss when I wrote it and when I recorded it later. And it's interesting, I'd thought of it solely in this sense of almost like a requiem for years, until I met this wonderful singer, songwriter, and lyricist, Susie Stern, who in the late 80s sent me a cassette of her lyric for Quiet Now.
Oh, really? I'll have to check it out.
Singing it. And I was just knocked out by it, because this was a song about being connected in the moment with someone you love. And she sung it so beautifully. If you'd like to hear it, man, it's on the internet. If you just at YouTube put Quiet Now Susie, S-U-Z Stern.
I'll check it out.
I recorded it with her on an album called 7 Stars. It came out briefly in 1995 and didn't have much distribution, but it was her album. and David Friesen is on bass, and
Wow.
what's his name? Alan Jones is the drummer.
Mhm.
Susie is singing it. For me, it's the most beautiful version of Quiet Now I've ever heard, man. I mean, she'll break your heart, man. The beautifully she sings this thing. My God, it's really lovely.
I mean, already in tune, you know, like that repetitiveness kind of, and the melodic thematic development you created. It's so beautiful in the harmony. So yeah, I'll check it out, definitely.
I think you'll really like her lyric and how she sings it, man.
I'll check it out. But how did then this story with Bill Evans happen with him?
Well, I don't know how he happened to hear the piece, but I assume he must have heard the album on which I first recorded it, which was called Live at the Trident. That was a Columbia album, came out in 1965. And Bill must have heard it, or perhaps he might have gone to our mutual publisher, which was called the Richmond Organization.
Okay.
They played the album for him, you know, hoping he might get interested in it. Well, he certainly got interested, my Lord. He recorded it 8 times at least in his career and played it virtually every night as part of his repertoire. I mean, I like the tune, but I couldn't bear to play the same tune that often of anybody's night after night, man. You know, so, but, you know, it gave the tune such exposure that it became somewhat of a jazz standard.
Absolutely, yeah.
Not because of me, man. You know?
Did you guys ever talk about that tune, or like with Bill?
Yeah, well, I would usually get together and hang out a bit with him when he would come through town, and he on a number of occasions said, "Man, you know, I just don't get tired of playing your tune, man. I don't know where that tune came from." And I said, "Bill, I don't really know where it came from either. It was for this stunt show I did back in college, you know, and that was it, you know."
It's amazing. I mean, it must have been for you an amazing feeling, you know, of Bill kept on playing this song. I mean,
yeah, how flattering is that the guy just keeps playing your tune, man? Wow, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Yeah, but I also wanted to ask you about the Tidal Wave. This story, I listened to the other day to this, I think like 3 times to Country Fair, this duo you have with John.
Yeah.
And, you know, Abercrombie being for me one of my guitar heroes. I mean, not mine, probably of everyone's, but like still one of the most underrated players, I would say. And
I loved John's playing, man. He was just the complete musician, man. He was.
How did the story with John happen? Actually, I mean,
he moved to San Francisco briefly and lived in San.
I didn't know that. Oh, really?
He did for several years. He was in San Francisco, so we got a chance to play together. And when I had this record date coming up for Palo Alto Jazz, Herb Wong, who was the A&R man and actually the CEO of the company, said, "Denny, I think it'd be interesting if you did an album that had a lot of different formats, you know, a little solo, little duo, little trio, little quartet.
Yeah.
Why don't we do that? It'll be extra interest." So I was thinking, well, if it's going to be a 4th player, who do I want to do it? Do I want to do it with a horn player or what? And I said, why not with John, man? Yeah, that would be great. And so that's how that thing came together.
Did you guys ever play duo gigs also, or like?
I never played a duo gig with John.
Oh wow, that would be amazing.
Never did.
Yeah, that duo sounds so amazing. I mean, it's like really. He had such an ear, you know. I saw him live so many times. I never got a chance to play with him, but I saw him live like 10 times at least, and it was always just like, man, you know, how do you do that? It's incredible.
He was extraordinary, man. Really, really extraordinary.
Yeah.
He had the quality of I heard him in a number of contexts. Everybody he played with, he made sound better.
Yeah,
just
true. And also Peter Donald on drums on that one.
Oh yeah, I love Peter, man. Peter and I played together for a number of years. We made several albums together. A couple albums for Windham Hill Jazz.
Yeah.
And I loved Peter's feeling on the drums, man. He just had a great fire and
amazing.
Yeah, he was a kick-ass drummer, man.
Yeah, I mean, like those Abercrombie records he did with Richie Byrick, I think it was on piano. And George Mraz. Woo.
Yeah, all those cats were wonderful, man.
Yeah,
I really look forward. When they would come into town, I would look forward. I'd love to hear them, and they were always very gracious, asked me to sit in, and it was just great playing with those guys, you know.
That's amazing. But
I got a chance to play with Peter then when I was looking for a new trio. I got Peter on drums, you know. And,
sure. Yeah, such a musician. I mean, but Danny, I wanted to ask you about this. I've read somewhere, like speaking of these early 80s, that then you also got a chance to play a duo with Herbie Hancock, which was recorded but never released or something like that. I don't know.
There was a concert in 1982 at the San Francisco Opera House.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That was done as a benefit for a beloved writer, reviewer, jazz reviewer named Conrad Silvert. And he needed help with his medical care. He was in the process of dying of testicular cancer. He was a young guy, he was in his early 30s. And he got a huge roster of people to play, you know, to donate their time at the Opera House to raise money for his medical care. It ended up like a 4-hour concert, and everybody you could think of was there. I mean, Wayne and Wynton Marsalis and Sonny Rollins and Jaco Pastorius, and Charlie Haden and Pat Metheny, just virtually just a tremendous roster of people. I was honored to be part of it. And Conrad sculpted what the program would be like. And he wanted to go from just solo to larger groups. Yeah. So he had me open with a solo piece. And then I played a duet with Charlie Haden.
Oh, wow.
And then Tony Williams came on, and then Pat Metheny. We
played. Oh, man.
And in the second half began with Herbie and I doing duo, 2 pianos.
Wow.
We did a kind of a warm-up that just morphed into a free improvisation into a statement of Straight No Chaser. And then we did Round About Midnight. There was an LP that came out on Columbia called Conrad Silvert Presents Jazz at the Opera House. And that, I think that brief little piece that Herbie and I did is on there. But a version of Round Midnight that I thought was terrific was not on there. I wish someday might get released, because I thought we did an interesting job with that piece. I've always loved Herbie, man. It just it's when he was first with Miles, when they would come through town, he would come over, because we were both from Chicago, and he would come over, and we used to just love to play 4-hand piano in my apartment, you know, and it was just it was always inspirational just to hear him and see how he would voice stuff, and we just loved to trade stuff back and forth, and I remember when I recorded Maiden Voyage on a Columbia album, Herbie came over and he hadn't heard it yet, and I was just delighted to play it for him, and he just loved it. So I was thrilled that he was pleased what I had done with his piece, you know.
Yeah. Oh, I can imagine, man. Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, just, but you know, sometimes it would be nice to be a fly in those moments, just to be there to see you guys, like, you know, like those moments. To be in the studio when, I don't know, Kind of Blue was recorded, or moments.
Yeah, wouldn't that have been something? Yeah, man.
Oh, man. Just, I have at my music school a poster, you know, of Miles, that one when he sits on the floor, on the chair in the studio. And Paul Chambers is in the back, like, when they were recording. And every time a student asked me, I was like, yeah, well, you know, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, yeah, wow. It's one of those moments, yeah. But you mentioned Wayne Shorter also was there. You know, you did a solo piano record of Wayne's compositions.
Yes, yeah.
And of Miles's compositions. What's the story behind your solo piano playing, and when did this begin? Like already in the 60s or around then? Or like, how did you evolve your solo piano playing?
Well, I began as a piano soloist as a little kid for years, never playing with anybody until I got into high school. I mean, solo music was the only thing I knew. Uh, and so I'd always been interested to keep developing as a piano soloist. And I guess the first solo piano album I made was an album called Soundings. It was made for a very small avant-garde label called 1750 Arch.
Haven't heard this one. I have to check it out.
It never was released on CD. It was just released as an LP. I'm hoping someday it may get re-released. But it was an album of free improvisations.
Really? Oh man!
Yeah, in 1978.
Find it somehow. Wow.
And then I've been interested to continue that, and I think really my relationship with Francois Zalakin at Sunnyside Records has been wonderful. I mean, he's a remarkable person, really understands and loves music, and he's just dedicated to documenting and preserving music, and he's given me a very free hand to explore music that I would like to present. And so I had begun doing a series of solo annual concerts at this Piedmont Piano Company in Oakland, California. It's a marvelous piano company. They have a stable of instruments that people would die for. I mean, just every wonderful make, perfectly maintained, and old pianos, new pianos, electric pianos. And so over a decade ago, maybe 12, 13 years ago, I started doing annual concerts there and recording them. So with Sunnyside, there's just been a series of solo albums coming out from that experience. And I guess I've done one or two solo albums in my studio that have been released on Sunnyside also. But the early Wayne album, which I decided I want to do a concert of his earlier compositions.
Yeah, like Juju and all that. I love that stuff.
That was done at the Piedmont Piano Company, and that was a lot of fun. Wayne has been a tremendous inspiration to me over the years as a soloist and as an improviser, as a composer. I think he's utterly in a class by himself, man. I think he's the best we've got, and it's just been amazing to have a chance to hear him.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree. Cool. Danny, not to take more of your time, I just wanted to ask you also, like, what are your plans? Do you have like a new trio album or something like that brewing up? Or
well, in terms of what's in the can,
yeah,
there's probably half of an album from the Mesro date with Buster and Matt.
Oh man, beautiful!
Might someday come out, because I mean they're pieces that I think are at the same what's been released. So I'm hoping that maybe there might be an album that has kind of multiple contributions. Might have some trio, might have some duo, might have some solo. So that's a possibility. And then I've got solo albums in the can. I have a hunch the next album that's going to come out on Sunnyside, what I'm going to suggest to Francois is a concert I did of Gershwin compositions.
Oh, really? Oh, man.
Gershwin. And I also have in the can a Richard Rodgers, a Harold Arlen, Jerome Kern, and Cole Porter.
Oh, so great. Wow.
I hope these might eventually come out. And George Marsh and I are now that as soon as it's safe, COVID has kept us apart, but sure. I think we're going to be able to hopefully start playing together again. So I'm hoping that there'll be some more electroacoustic duet music that's going to emerge from that too. So that's kind of what I have in mind.
Man, beautiful. Man, bring it on. Yeah, beautiful. Cool. Thank you so much for sharing some of this stuff. So
it's very nice to hang out with you, man.